Firstly, welcome to this webinar 5CO03, a support webinar for learners and centres. This recorded webinar is one of a series of webinars for the units of the CIPD Associate Diploma in People Management and the CIPD Associate Diploma in Organisational Learning and Development. The webinars are aimed at learners working towards either of these diplomas or for those supporting learners working towards the CIPD diplomas. 5CO03 is a core unit in the diplomas. In fact, it's the third core unit, and it has the full title, Professional Behaviours and Valuing People. So what's the unit about? Well, essentially, the unit looks at the behaviours we would expect of people working in our profession, the people profession, at this level. It considers ethical principles and values and how we as individuals apply these values to our work. It also considers professionalism and what we as professionals do to develop and maintain our professional competence, ensuring we are always ready and able to fulfill the requirements of our role. Like most of the units, 5CO03 has several theoretical aspects, so there are plenty of opportunities for you to evidence your wider reading. But unlike most of the units, 5CO03 also has a rather practical and personal aspect, where it requires you as an individual to look inwards, reflect on your practice, and write about your approach to work and your behaviour generally. The assessment briefs are written specifically to enable learners to meet all the requirements of the relevant unit, as mentioned 5CO03. Because the briefs are updated on a regular basis, it's really important that you are working with the correct brief. The image you can see here is the front page of the current assessment brief, and this is the one you should be working with. You can check that by looking at that assessment ID under the main heading there, and the assessment ID that you should be working with is CIPD 5CO03 2501, meaning it's the first assessment brief issued in this qualification year for this unit. A couple of important notes, a couple of things to notice there are the 3 bullet points at the bottom. The first one just confirms what I've just said, that this assessment brief is the one released in June 2025. Importantly, though, is that this assessment brief will expire in June 2026, so it won't be valid after June 2026. And very important for both centres and learners is to note that the last moderation window for assignments done against this brief will be September 2026. So that's the assessment brief, the front page of the assessment brief you should be working with. So let's now have a look what's in the assessment brief. So for your first look inside the assessment brief, it's really important, and we'd strongly recommend that you get the big picture, really, the overall assessment requirements. You need to be clear about everything you're going to have to do before you get started. So this slide covers the overall assessment requirements. And all assessment briefs are made up of a number of tasks, usually 1, 2 or 3 tasks. In this case, you have 2 separate assessment tasks. And as it tells you there, your first task will be a case study with 6 related questions. So they will be general questions around our subject based on a case study, which we will go into in more detail soon. But there is a second task, and this is where we ask you to go more inwards, to think more about yourself. And this is where you're asked to undertake a professional review in which you consider your strengths and weaknesses, your development needs, and also some prior experience of development, a reflection on some of the development you've already undertaken. So there's 2 separate assessment tasks within the brief, and we'll now turn our attention to the first of those. So we're looking at task 1, which we know is a case study. But before we get into the detail of that case study, the assessment brief gives us a little bit more information, which we should read before we start, so we're clear about what we're setting out to do. So the information that we're given is that, first of all, the focus of this activity, the focus of the case study, is on the purpose and value of the people professional. So we need to have that in mind when we're responding to the case study questions. We're also told that there are 6 questions. They're the first 6 questions, questions 1 to 6 of the assessment brief, and that we should respond accurately to each of the 6 questions. So implicit in that is the idea that we should read the questions carefully and respond accurately to what's being asked. Wherever possible, our responses should be informed by wider reading. This activity in particular is a chance for you to demonstrate that you have read widely and that you do have a good understanding of the subject. Of course, anytime you do use wider reading in your response, it should be correctly referenced. Your responses should be clearly presented, of course, and they should also be word count compliant. And for this activity, it states further down in the brief that you have 2,400 words for this whole of task 1, just for task 1, that is. And remember, you've got 6 questions, so that's approximately 400 words a question. But of course, that doesn't mean that you don't have to apportion them equally. Apportion them as you think is correct. Some questions may need a longer response to answer them fully. But you can work that out as you go. But a sort of rule of thumb is that you've approximately 400 words for your responses to each of those questions. So now we can get started on the case study. The brief gives a scenario which is set in an organisation, a small software development organisation called Nexobyte. A Nexobyte is where you have just secured a new position as HR L&D advisor. There's quite a bit of information about Nexobyte, particularly that it's not been going very long, that it was started by one person, Kit, but that it now has 2 partners, 3 team managers, 23 software engineers and 2 administrators. So just in terms of staff numbers, Nexobyte has grown considerably over the 2 years since its startup. And with that rapid growth, we can identify that there are some real concerns. So for example, there's a lack of standard procedures, a lack of management capabilities, maybe managers were brought in quickly, not always for the right reasons, and that some managers are operating independently. And naturally there are consequences of those situations. So the type of things that we're told are happening are that employees are complaining, some valuable staff are leaving. So Aisha, one of the partners, has particularly brought you in, this is your challenge, as HR L&D advisor, with a view to sorting out some of these problems and also making a more positive situation going forward. So we said there are 6 questions connected to this case study, all within task 1. And this is question 1 of that first task. So for question 1, we're presented with a small situation. And that situation is that Aisha, remember Aisha, the director that has brought you in, Aisha has asked you to make a short presentation at the first management meeting. Aisha set up a network, a series of management meetings. And at the first one, she'd like you to attend and do a presentation about what it means to be a people professional and some of the ways you can contribute at Nexobyte. So that's the situation, a little bit of background to the question. But what you actually have to do is provide a written response covering the points that you would include in this presentation. So if you were to do a presentation with that title, what points would you want to include? And remember, you've got about 400 words, I think we said, which you can flex a little bit to respond to this question. It's really important that you take note of the words in red font there. There is absolutely no requirement to present anything in the sense of standing up and doing any kind of presentation. That's purely a scenario, purely part of the scenario, something Aisha's asked you to do. But the question requires you only to think about what you would include in such a presentation. So it is purely a written task. You're asked to respond by providing a written response covering the points you would include in this presentation. And we're going to dive into that question a little bit more in the next slide. So we're still on question 1, and we're thinking about what you would include in this written response to question 1. And if we look carefully at that question, there's really 2 parts to it. So the first part of the question is what it means to be a people professional. And the second part is some of the ways you can contribute at Nexabyte. So when you're responding to this question, you need to make sure that you include both. So the first part of that question, you're likely to consider things like, what is the purpose of a people professional? What's the value of them? What does it involve? This might be a place for you to reference the CIPD map or another framework you're familiar with, or to bring in your wider reading. So within your response, you're really giving an appraisal, your own appraisal of what it means to be a people professional. So what does it mean to be a people professional? You need to think about that. Think about the things we've said there, purpose, value, what's involved, and answer that part of the question. But as we said, there is a second part here. As well as talking generally about a people professional, you then need to make links from that to how that could help Nexabyte. So the second part of the question, think about how you, as a people professional, newly recruited to Nexabyte, could use your people professional expertise to help at Nexabyte. So I would look at the case study, think about the problems that have been identified, and then how you, as a people professional, could offer something that would address those problems. So you're bringing in some relevant contributions, relevant ways that you could help improve things at Nexabyte. So all of that together is question 1. As we said, around 400 words, give or take a little bit, to answer both parts of that question. And that's the end of question 1. And in the next slide, we'll move to question 2. So moving on to question 2. Again, we're presented with a small, short situation and then an actual question, something we have to do. So the situation here is that you're excited by your new role. You're happy to have been recruited to Nexabyte. And you can see that there's plenty to do, but you feel ready for this challenge. You're excited and ready to take on the role. That's the situation, but then the question, or what you have to do, is discuss 2 of your personal or ethical values that you believe will help you in your new role, and how consistently applying these will inform your people practice work at Nexabyte. So again, with a small situation where you're ready and excited for the role, and a question. And there's 2 parts to that question. Firstly, that you discuss your personal or ethical values, 2 of them. And secondly, that you discuss how application of those values will inform your practice at Nexabyte. And in the next slide, again, we'll dive a bit deeper into how you might respond to that question. So we're still on question 2, but we're digging a little bit deeper into our response. So as we've said, there's 2 parts to this question. So the first part is to discuss 2 of your values. It says that these might be ethical or personal values. Don't get too hung up on that. Values are values. What's important to you? What are your values? What do you believe in? Maybe it's about integrity, maybe it's about the way you work, maybe it's about fairness, equality. It could be all kinds of things. What are your values? Be honest here. Come up with something that's genuine that are 2 of your values. So identify those and discuss what they mean to you. How have they shown up in your behaviour or your work? Tell us about your values. That's quite a sort of general thing about you, but then the second part of that question, for each of your 2 values, you also need to show how it will show up again in your work with Nexabyte. So if you're about being fair or equality, then maybe that will show up in a way that you bring policies in. Maybe it will be about how you implement policies in the workplace, that they are embracing everyone's needs. If it's about honesty or openness, maybe it will affect the way you communicate. So they're just examples, but for each of your values, consider how they might show up, how they will be seen in your work at Nexabyte. So a good full question there about your values and your application of them. Important stuff. So you've got around 400 words, but with that flex that we've talked about, to respond to question 2 about your values and how they will inform your work. So that's question 2. Question 3 now, and again, similar pattern, similar structure. So first of all, we have a small situation where Aisha has emphasized that she wants you to be a firm voice for people practice. She wants you to be firm and solid as a voice for people practice at Nexabyte. So this means communicating with the management team in an informed, clear and confident way that will convince them of the managers for change and new ways of working. So that's the situation which you need to think about before you tackle the question. But then we move on to the actual question and what we have to do. So what we have to do is explain why it's important to communicate with the management team in an informed, clear and confident way, and to extend that to potential consequences, one for you and one for Nexabyte, if you are unable to communicate in that informed, clear and confident way. So again, it's quite clear what's required of you, question 3 there. And again, as before, there are kind of 2 aspects to that question. So in the next slide, we will have a look at how you might address that question. So delving into this question, question 3, a bit more deeply, and particularly into that first part about the importance of communicating in a certain way, it would be perhaps a good idea to start this response by confirming that idea that communication is important to our role. Why is it important that people practitioners can communicate well? Is that something about our product? Our product being often communication and influencing people to do the right thing, to follow good practice, be compliant, etc., etc. So bring out perhaps why communication here is important. And then it would be useful to tackle those 3 words. Those 3 words, informed, clear and confident, are there for a reason. They're there because they are very relevant and they describe a good way for us to communicate as people practitioners. So you could bring those into your response. Why is it important that our communication is informed? Well, would it be okay if we just maybe gave a few details if we didn't really know what we were talking about, but we still recommended something based on a few rough facts. How important is it that we get it right, that we are informed, that we know our subject? So think about that. Why do we need to be informed? Why do we need to be clear? Is it important that people understand us? Is it important that we're not ambiguous in what we say? If we are passing on a message to someone about something they should do or the way a company should behave, why is it important that we're clear in that? And if we're not clear initially, which is understandable, that happens in human communication, then is it about our ability to clarify and keep clarifying until things are properly understood? What about being confident in our communication? Is that important? What if we don't sound confident? We might not always be confident. It can be difficult sometimes to carry that responsibility. But sounding confident is important if people are going to believe in us, if people are going to have any trust in what we say, and people are going to feel confident themselves. We need maybe to pass on that confidence. So think about those three words. As we say, they're there for a reason, and answer that first part of the question. Why is it important that people practitioners can communicate in a way that is informed, clear, and confident to inform other people? That's not the end of this question, of course. There is an extra bit here, an interesting bit to add on to the end of your explanation, and these are about the consequences of not communicating in those ways. So if you were not informed, clear, and confident, how might that affect you as a people practitioner? Could it affect your credibility, for example? Could it affect the way your competence is perceived? Could it even impact the way your loyalty or the way you're trusted? So think about the consequences for you. There may be big consequences, there may be small consequences. And what about for Nexabyte? If Nexabyte have a people practitioner who is unable to convince other people of anything, where might that leave them in terms of compliance, in terms of doing the right thing? Maybe they would miss doing something they should do, or maybe they would do the wrong thing. Think about what those consequences could be for an organisation where the people practitioner was unable to convince managers of behaving in certain ways or following certain policies or paths. So an interesting question, one for you to really think about there. Think about styles of communication, why it's important to be informed, clear and confident, and think about the potential consequences. An example, one for you and one for Nexabyte, of communication not being well undertaken. Question 4. So the case study continues, and we're told about some interesting situations that have developed at Nexabyte prior to you being recruited. So the question follows the similar pattern to the previous ones. We begin with those situations. So in this case, you've learned about some of the problems that had occurred previously, and these included what is deemed generously unethical behaviour, in that a manager regularly approving attendance at expensive training events for favourite team members, whilst refusing similar requests from others. So it sounds like there's some unfairness there. And the second situation is deemed to be illegal behaviour, and this is where an employee, a former employee, was using Nexabyte resources, time, equipment to operate their own separate side business. So not just that they were that they had a side business, but that it was illegal because they were using Nexabyte time and equipment to operate that business. So two situations there. And the question is for you to explain that if you had been aware of these two situations when they existed, how you would have approached and raised them. So you weren't there when these happened, but if you had been, how would you have approached these situations and raised them? So We're given these two situations at Nexabyte. The first one is the unethical example. And so this is the one about the unfair treatment. So we think it's unfair. The situation described suggests that it is. It could even have been illegal. Maybe there was some unfairness based on protected characteristics, or there may be something that takes it beyond ethical into illegal. At best, this situation is obviously causing some dissatisfaction or has caused dissatisfaction, and it seems ethically wrong. It seems ethically wrong to treat people differently, although at this stage we might not have all the facts. Nevertheless, you're asked if that was happening when you were in position at Nexabyte, what would you have done? How would you have approached and raised it? So you need to think about, would you have taken action? Would you have done something? You're a people practitioner here and people are dissatisfied by a manager's behaviour. So would you have taken action? Hopefully you would. But what would you have done? Who would you speak to? Would you perhaps have looked into it in more detail? Would you have spoken to the manager? Maybe you would have spoken to the employees and found out some more. Or would you have spoken to one of the directors straight away? What would you choose to do? Who would you speak to? And what would you say? What would be your approach in this scenario? The second example is illegal, and I think it's quite useful here to take the two separately, as in the slide. So you're showing that you're aware of the difference here. There's two examples, unethical and illegal. So I think you can be explicit about that in your response. So in this second example of illegal behaviour, there's no real doubt here. We know it is illegal. This person has been running a business using Nexabyte equipment and time. So we know that it was an illegal situation. And obviously within that, it's also very unethical. They're taking advantage and taking resources from other people, stealing really. So in this situation, faced with this illegal behaviour, what would you have done? Again, hopefully you would have done something, but what would you have done? Who would you speak to? Would you speak to the person involved here? Or assuming you had the facts and you knew it to be illegal behaviour, would you speak to one of the directors? A lot might depend on how you found out, and you might want to bring that out in your response. But how would you respond? What would you do? Who would you speak to? What would you say? What would you expect to be the outcome here? So two situations, not current, but happened prior to you being employed at this organisation. And to answer this question, you need to think about, use your knowledge, use your reading, use your competence and expertise to give a good answer about how you as a people practitioner would respond to each of these situations. So now we're on to question 5, and we follow the same sort of pattern and structure as in the previous questions. So that means that we begin with a little bit of a situation from the scenario. And the situation here is that the presentation you did, remember we talked about Aisha asking you to do a presentation, although you didn't have to do that for your assignment. But in the scenario, Aisha had asked you to do a presentation to the managers. And as far as you're concerned, that presentation went really well. You were doing a presentation about the value of people professionals to the organisation, and as far as you were concerned, it went well. However, one of the managers has since made a comment in a group chat, an organisation group chat, that has surprised you a little. And the comment is, as it says there, we don't really need to change anything. The company is doing well financially, and anyway, people work much harder when they are not protected by a load of feel-good policies and procedures. So that comment has come from one of the managers. You've seen it on the manager chat group, and obviously you're feeling slightly perturbed by that. It's not what you wanted them to come away from your presentation with, and it may just be one person's viewpoint. But nevertheless, you don't want to let that fester. You want to do something about it and respond and stop it becoming bigger than it is already. So you want to respond in a way that's professional and informative. You're going to be assertive and competent and calm and professional and all those things, and respond in a way that will inform and hopefully change the views expressed by that manager. We've already talked about how important it is to communicate in a clear and informed way. And for this question, you are expected to show that informed ability. So as soon as you see the words with reference to research or theory in a question, this is a perfect opportunity to show off your wider knowledge, show off your reading, make use of referencing. It's made for that. The actual question is, with reference to research or theory, argue the human and business benefits of people feeling included, valued, and fairly treated at work. So this isn't just your view, although that's important, but you are expected to bring in other people's views, other research and theory. And in the next slide, we'll just have a look at that in a little bit more detail. So still on question 5, we're now being asked to argue the human and business benefits of people feeling included, valued, and fairly treated at work. So looking at the wording of this question, we know that we need to bring in our wider reading. So we need to think about any theories or models or surveys or research, any evidence, anything you're aware of that talks about, that informs us about the benefits of people feeling that inclusion. Now, increasingly, there is more and more evidence relating to that concept. And you might remember to look at both aspects here. You're looking at human benefits. So what are the benefits for workers of good treatment at work? And there you might look at some of the motivation theories. There's lots around about whether people are more motivated when they feel included, whether they are more likely to feel job satisfaction. What about their loyalty? What about their organizational loyalty? You can relate to all kinds of articles on employee experience. Why do we care about employee experience? What are the benefits for humans? So there's a whole load of research that you can look at there. And equally, it's not just about people feeling good. We also know increasingly, and more and more research is appearing about the business benefits of people feeling included and well treated at work. So there's all kinds of research. There's research by Robertson, Sabawal, Nishi, some examples there for you. But there's also lots of surveys. Some of the big opinion companies such as McKinsey, Gallup. There's all kinds of sources where you can look to that will help you understand the benefits for humans and businesses, organizations, of people feeling included at work. So you need to, just jumping back to the blue square there, you need to come up with an argument, and you need to bring theories and models into it. So it's a good idea to say what other people are thinking. So you're arguing on the sense that so-and-so says this, but on the other hand, someone says this. These are the advantages, but there may be disadvantages. But it's also good within an argument to bring your own conclusion into that. What's your position? What's your argument? How would you argue for that kind of treatment at work? What do you believe? So for question 5, you are putting forward an argument for good treatment, as described there, good treatment at work. You are making an argument for it to convince managers, and you are doing that argument or making that argument in an informed way by bringing in theories, models, research, etc. that you're aware of. So as we've said, a great question to show off some of that wider reading. Question 6. So we've already made it to the last question in task 1. And question 6 follows that same pattern again that you should be getting used to now, of giving us a situation and then the question. So it's very specific about this is a situation, but this is what you have to do. So the situation here is that due to all the complaints about unfair practice, Aisha has asked you to devise a staff learning and development policy which is fair and which will include all staff members and set out factors such as paid time for development activities, individual training budgets, type of learning activities, etc., etc. So the situation is that you have been asked to devise a learning and development policy. However, that is just the situation. The question is slightly different. The question is that you have to discuss the steps you would take to make your design of this initiative fair and inclusive, and to discuss the steps you would take to check if your implementation of this policy had worked, if it was fair and inclusive as intended. So, although the situation is as described, the question only wants you to talk about how you'd make it fair, what you'd do beforehand as part of your preparation, and how you'd check that it was fair after it had been implemented. So it's really important that you follow the question here and note that red font there. There is no need to devise a policy here. No one is asking you to devise a policy to answer this question. What you are being asked to do are two things: discuss the steps you'd take towards making it fair, and discuss the steps you would take after 3 months to check that it was fair. So it's really important here that you stick with the question. The scenario is just the context. What you have to answer is the question. And in the next slide, as you may have guessed, we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. So question 6, we're thinking about how we would go about developing this policy. And we've got, again, as in many of the questions, two aspects to the question. The first relating to the design stage of a policy, and the second relating to the post-implementation stage. So thinking about the first part, the design stage, if you were going to develop a policy, in this case about training, what steps would you take to try and make it a good and fair policy? So it might be that you are going to liaise with people. Who would you liaise with? How would you liaise with people? Would you have a focus group? Would you do a survey? Would you perhaps go and look at policies in other organisations? There are all kinds of steps that you would and should take when you're designing a policy to ensure that it's a good policy, that it's an effective policy, that it's a fair policy. So you just need to think about how you would ensure that you came up with a good and fair policy. So we want some steps from you, some ideas about how you would go about doing that. That's the first part of the question. And in the second part of the question, we've moved on now to where the policy had been implemented. It's been around for 3 months, and your job now is to ensure that it is working as intended. So how would you check? What steps would you take to check a policy after implementation? So again, it may be about talking to people. It may be about analysing results. It may be about observing things. There could be all kinds of ways, but this is for you to come up with examples of how you could review and check that this policy, which in this case is a L&D policy, that how you would check that it is fair and reaching all those it is intended to reach, that it's a fair and equitable policy, if that's its intention. So question 6, again, a nice substantial question to think about, and you're purely doing what the question says, discussing steps you would take beforehand and steps you would take afterwards. So that's question 6, and that's actually your last question in task 1. So when you have got to this point, when you reach this point in your assignment, you've done well. You have completed task 1, and you should at this stage have written responses to 6 questions, questions 1 to 6 in the brief. And Those 6 responses should amount to a word count of approximately 2,400 words. So task 1, very straightforward, a scenario, situations for each question, 6 questions, 2,400 words, and when you get to that point, question 1 is done. So you can put that aside and turn your focus now to task 2. So when you're ready, we will begin task 2. Task 2 is the second and last task of the assessment brief, and as mentioned previously, it is a professional review. And by that, we mean a review in which you consider your strengths and your weaknesses, and therefore your development needs, and also some prior experience of development. So as well as looking at your current position, we're looking at how you have developed previously, what your response is to development activities, and how you're evolving, if you're evolving, and what that evolving looks like. So that's task 2, and that's what we're going to look at in the next slide. As with task 1, task 2 begins with some information to help you complete the task effectively. So we've got 6 bullet points there to consider. So first of all, the guidance tells us that task 2 is not connected to task 1. So this is where you can forget about the scenario, about the case study. There is no connection here with the original task. So this is completely different, forget the case study. Also that there are 5 questions here, questions 7 to 11, 1 to 6 were in task 1, so you're now addressing questions 7 to 11 in task 2. And again, obviously you need to read those questions carefully and respond accurately to the question. Bullet point 3 tells us that there will be feedback required from other people for question 7. So you need to be prepared for this. You may need to think about that now. You may want to start thinking of who would be a suitable person to give you feedback. So don't just think about that now, who can I ask? First of all, look at what the feedback's going to be about and pick a person that would be appropriate to give you feedback on that particular item. But there is a little warning there to be prepared for question 7. Also, it's worth noting that just one question in task 2, question 8, requires you to evidence wider reading. Now that's unusual in the assessment briefs. Usually you are required to evidence wider reading for most of the questions. And in task 1, I think every question requires some evidence of wider reading. But in task 2, because it's so personal and about you, you really only have to reference wider reading in one question, and that's question 8. So that's a bonus for you here. You can focus on yourself and not worry about what other people are saying. Question 11 the 5th bullet point refers to question 11, and that's also giving you a little warning that question 11 requires you to have some CPD, some continued professional development documentation that you can use. If you haven't got any already, you will need to set some up because you are required to submit some form of CPD record, whether that's your own tabular format, your CIPD format records, pages from the CIPD My Reflections tool, anything that is appropriate as a CPD record. And the last bullet point there tells you that the word count for questions 7 to 10, so that's 7, 8, 9 and 10, 4 questions is 850 words. So you've got around 200 plus 210, 15 words per question for those 4 questions 7 to 10. But that question 11, and this is another bonus, is that question 11 is not included in the word count. So when it comes to question 11, where you are putting forward your continuing professional development documentation, you have free range there that is not limited by the word count. So they're all important factors to note, 6 points there. Make sure you read them and take them on board before you start your task 2. So we said that task 2 had 5 questions, and the first of those is question 7. And question 7 says that using a combination of your own reflections and feedback from at least one other person, review your behaviour against the 6 associate level standards for working inclusively from the CIPD profession map. So let's just unpick that question. So a combination of your own reflections and feedback from at least one other person. Do you remember in that last slide we said that you needed to think about someone who could give you feedback for certain behaviours? Well, this is where you're going to need that feedback. And what you're being asked for feedback against are these 6 associate level standards for working inclusively in the CIPD profession map. So you need to think about someone who would know about you and know about your behaviour in relation to these standards or these factors. So when you look at the CIPD profession map, and there is a link in the assessment brief, and we'll also provide it in the next slide, you need to find the behaviour working inclusively, and within that behaviour you need to find the associate level standards. So just looking at that chart there, that kind of beige grey chart, you can see that there are actually 7 criteria down the left hand of the first column, but that the 4th one doesn't apply. So those other 6 are the 6 standards. The second column with the F at the top stands for foundation, so you don't need to bother with that one. And the third column, CM, stands for Chartered Manager, and the 4th, Chartered Fellow. So again, you don't need to worry about those 2. The one you do need to concern yourself with is that middle column, headed Associate. So that is where you can find the 6 associate level standards. So you need to reflect on, with help from someone else, how your behaviour is in terms of inclusivity. Do you get to know people as individuals? Do you value diversity? Do you seek out and listen to diverse and fused opinions? Or are you quite rigid in your thinking? What do you like at building relationships? Do you try to build purposeful working relationships at work? Do you try and collaborate and make a positive working environment? What about sharing knowledge? Are you willing to share knowledge where it's appropriate, to share your expertise with others to solve problems? What about conflict resolution? Do you try to resolve conflict? Do you look for positive and constructive ways of solving problems? And what about psychological safety? Are you able to encourage others to recognise when they need help? Can you recognise when others need help? When you do recognise that, are you able to help as much as possible? And what about where you have some responsibility in that? Are you able to admit your mistakes, to share your concerns and ideas? Are you able to manage your own psychological safety, in fact? So 6 standards there to assess yourself against. And in the next slide, we'll just summarise what we're expecting you to do for this question. So to summarise question 7, what you have to do is to undertake a review against those 6 associate standards relating to working inclusively. They're the standards that we have just looked at on the last slide, but there is a link there in small red font on this PowerPoint and also in the assessment brief. So your review is against those standards, and it's based on your reflections plus feedback from one another. And it would make sense there to identify and choose someone who would know about you in terms of that aspect of your behaviour. It's important that you choose the right person. Getting feedback from somebody, feedback is a very valuable thing to receive, and so make the most of it. Don't just do it for the sake of the question. Do it to learn from it. Ask for feedback from someone who you trust and respect and who is going to give you honest feedback. And then use that feedback to inform your own reflections on your behaviour against these standards. Just a little tip there. Most people are busy. Often being asked to give feedback on someone can be a small burden in the working day. So make it easy for them. For example, you might want to construct a small questionnaire based around those 6 standards. So make it easy, encourage them to give you feedback quickly. The longer they leave it, often the less chance there is of it coming back. So choose the right person, make it easy for them, make it clear what you need feedback on. It's not just general feedback, you need it in relation to those standards. And of course, it doesn't have to be just one person, it can be more than one. Having carried out your review, which has involved your own reflections, your own thoughts, thinking back about how you've performed in the past, and feedback from at least one other person, you then need to summarise your conclusions. So your response to question 7 is really a summary of the conclusions from your review. And within that summary, briefly explain who gave you feedback and how their feedback informed your assessment, and of course what those conclusions are. One bonus of this question, as we mentioned in that pre-information, question 7 does not require evidence of wider reading. It's all about focusing on you, your behaviours, looking inwards and thinking about how do you behave, what do you do well, what do you do not so well, where might there be room for improvement. So that's a nice inward-looking question, question 7, for you to complete. Question 8. Question 8 is still about you, but this does have a generalised aspect to it as well. So this is the one question in task 2 that does need some evidence of wider reading. But it is about you, just like the rest of them in this task. So question 8, what do you have to do? Well, you're asked to research and identify 2 ways the people practitioner role is evolving. So you can take whatever aspect of the people practitioner role you want. It could be a generalist role, it could be something specific, it could be an L&D practitioner, a reward practitioner, someone involved in employee relations, etc. It might be your specific role, as long as you are clear at the beginning about the role you are talking about. And then you have to consider 2 developments, 2 ways in which that role is changing. And this is your chance to show your wider reading here, because there are any number of articles at the moment about how the role is changing, and lots of different ways it is changing. You might think about a pestle analysis in this, so you might think about technology in particular, but you might also think about politics or even environmental, different ways that this role is changing as you see it. There is a second part to the question, and that is, what are the implications of these changes for you, for your CPD? So if you go for the big one, which most people might go for, which is AI, artificial intelligence, then what's the implications of that for you? Are you up to speed on that? Do you have a big skills gap? Are there implications for your CPD? Hopefully you won't just fall back on AI, because there's all kinds of ways in which our roles are changing. So what else is happening? What other developments are there? What implications does that have? It might be a language thing, it might be a physical skill, it might be about having a license for something. It could be all kinds of things that throw up implications for your CPD. And so think fully and properly and honestly about how you see your people practitioner or the people practitioner role changing, and what implications you see there for your own CPD. And don't forget that bit about evidence of wider reading. This is the only question in task 2, you have to do it, but don't miss that. So question 9, we're moving rapidly on here, and question 9 follows on from questions 7 and 8, in that it's now asking you to consider your conclusions from those 2 questions. Question 7, which was about looking at your behaviours in terms of working inclusively, and question 8, which is about your research into developments in the profession. And you're asked to consider your conclusions from those and to use those to assess what you believe to be your main strengths and your main weaker areas in relation to people practice. So you don't need much in the way of strengths and weaknesses here. 2 is probably enough, 2 of each. What do you see as your strengths? What do you see as your weaknesses? Maybe 2 or 3 of each. Not many. We're not looking for, this might be part of a bigger assessment. It might be part of a bigger review you may be doing elsewhere. But for your assignment, it's been limited and held within boundaries to keep it manageable for the assignment. So in terms of your assessment here, you're considering your conclusions from Q7 and Q8, and you are bringing them together in an assessment of your strengths and weaknesses in relation to the areas you've looked at. So a couple of weaknesses, a couple of strengths is plenty, but then take those weaknesses in particular forward into areas you might want to develop. So we need you to start thinking about, and you'll be taking this forward in the next question, how you might want to progress further. So let's move on to that next question in question 10. So question 10, and you can see how task 2 is really one concentrated activity that the questions have broken down into steps for you. So it's very much a unified, discrete activity, a nice inward-looking activity. And so you've already reviewed your behaviour, you've had feedback, you've considered future developments, and you've assessed some strengths and weaknesses. So in question 10, we're now following on from that, following on from your self-assessment, asking you to identify 2 activities, two development activities that you will undertake or at least commence in the next 6 months. So it's all following on from questions 7, 8, 9, and you're now thinking about what were you going to do in terms of your own development in the next 6 months, at least start in the next 6 months. So when you decide what that's going to be, you need to briefly explain what your 2 activities are going to be, and they can be anything. It doesn't have to be, we're not necessarily looking for a formal course here, although it can be. You might choose a learning program online or face-to-face or seminar or a conference or whatever, or you might look to something more informal. It might be a secondment at work, a task, a project at work. It might be some reading, a podcast, looking at a video. Whatever it is, doesn't matter what type of activity, it's about the relevance and the accuracy of your choice of activity to help you progress forwards. So for each activity you choose, and you only need 2, you're also asked to explain why you chose them. What did you want to achieve? How do they link to your assessment? What is it about them that makes them desirable? If you've chosen to, if you have chosen, let's stick with the obvious example, you've chosen to undertake a program about AI, then why have you chosen that particular method? What was it about it? Have you chosen an online program? Why? Was it because it was flexible and convenient? Or maybe you've chosen a face-to-face program because you feel you can get more from that. You can ask the questions you need. You can personalize and customize it. So why? We want to know, why did you choose it? Was it because it was appropriate, desirable? Was it about the method, the content, the timing, etc.? Also, if there's anyone else involved, have you chosen to undertake an activity with someone else or with a team, and if so, why? And maybe it suited your learning preferences, does it? So anything there, they're not tick boxes. You don't have to respond to each of those 6 bullet points there. They are examples, ideas to help you explain why you have chosen those 2 activities. So the important thing for question 10 is that you identify 2 activities to undertake or commence in the next 6 months, and you explain why you have chosen those particular ones. That's question 10. For question 11, we're going to shift our focus completely from looking forwards to our development to looking backwards to development we have already undertaken. And this symbol here is really just to set that scene for you, not to think about what you're going to do going forwards. There's no waiting involved here. We're not waiting till you've undertaken anything. We want you to respond straight away at the point of doing the assignment, looking backwards to development you have already undertaken. So our next question, which is about this, is question 11. So question 11 says that shift your focus to development activities you've already undertaken, and that they should be within the last 2 years, and that you're asked to reflect on the 2 activities that you consider had the greatest impact on your behaviour and performance. So just unpicking that, we're looking for 2 activities undertaken or mostly undertaken within the last 2 years that you consider to have had the greatest impact on you, on your behaviour and performance. So we're looking for quality rather than quantity here. You need to pick 2 activities of any type that you felt had a big effect on you, a big impact. So think carefully about that. You need to give yourself something to write about. You've only 2 activities to write about, and you're not held back by word count here. You have free range to write about those activities. So think about what has impacted you and how has it impacted you. And having thought about all of that, you then need to provide those reflections as a written response. And they can be either as your own format CPD record or a report from the CIPD My CPD Reflections tool. When we say your own format CPD record or PD record, it really is can be something quite similar. Usually it might be a tabular document. The most important thing is that you tell us what the activity is and what impact it had. The actual format doesn't matter too much. It doesn't matter whether it's your own, whether it's CIPD's, whether it's one developed by your centre or by your organisation, as long as it provides some kind of vehicle in which you can write about the impact development activities have had on your performance and behaviour. The brief also mentions that in terms of doing any format you want for your CPD record, you can equally use the CIPD My CPD Reflections tool, which some of you may be used to using now. So you can access that through the CIPD website, and that system will allow you to fill in. It will ask you questions about what you've done and how it impacted on you. So again, 2 pages from that, or however many pages you need to reflect those 2 activities, will also suffice. So it really is up to you how you respond to this question. What's important is that you really focus on the impact of the activities on your behaviour and performance. And when you're thinking about impact, you might think in terms of, have you gained a greater understanding? Have you gained more knowledge or new skills? What did you gain from the activity? Maybe you learned about a task or job or work or about life or just about yourself. But that's part of it, the learning. But then how has that changed you? How has that impacted your performance or your behaviours? How is any of that different because of the learning you've undertaken? So again, a great meaty part of the activity, thinking about what impact have those 2 activities had on you and how have you changed as a result of them. And that brings you to the end of task 2. So when you've completed all 4 questions with written responses and the 5th question with a CPD record or reports as described, then, as we say, task 2 is complete. Well done. And as task 2 is complete, that means the whole assessment brief has now been completed. So, as good as it feels to have got to the end of all the tasks, it's always worth just carrying out a few final checks, including, have you read all the instructions carefully? Have you responded accurately to those instructions, to those questions? Have you made it clear which question you're responding to? So you might want to do some form of signposting, perhaps small subheadings. You can see the examples there, and the first one uses the full question. The second example is a redaction of the question, just to make it maybe neater, more concise. Totally up to you, as long as your assessor can see clearly where you're responding to each question. Have you included evidence of wider academic reading where required? which is almost everywhere except for those questions in task 2. We've added a little plus there because even sometimes if you think, oh, I don't need to do academic reading here, sometimes it's fine if you still do. You might still enhance your response. So it's never wrong to include evidence of wider academic reading, but there are some questions where it's not an actual requirement. Have you proofread your responses? Whilst you wouldn't be penalised for the odd mistake, it does have to be legible and well presented. And have you complied with the evidence and word count requirements, all of which are clearly stated on your assessment brief? And if all of that is okay, just make sure that you've added your name and your learner number, that you've complied with any admin requirements that your centre requires of you, and above all, that you submit your assignment on time. There's no point doing the best ever assignment if you then fail to submit it on time. Make sure you're aware of the submission date and that you get it in for that date. So you have now reached the end of this webinar. So it's worth noting that there are recorded webinars for the other units in the associate diplomas. And finally, we would like to wish you good luck with your assignment and thank you for staying with us throughout this webinar.